In the spring of 1811, workers demolishing an old tobacco warehouse in Richmond, Virginia, made a discovery that would haunt the city for generations. Hidden beneath rotting floorboards, they found 8 identical wooden boxes, each containing a man's wedding ring and a small vial of what appeared to be medicinal powder. The rings bore different names, different dates, but all shared one chilling detail. They had belonged to the husbands of Ruth Holloway, a woman who had somehow outlived 8 wealthy men in the span of 30 years. What authorities found in those vials would challenge everything they thought they knew about the refined widow, who had once been the toast of Virginia society. The local magistrate ordered the discovery sealed from public record, citing matters of delicate nature that could damage the reputation of prominent families. For over 2 centuries, this case has remained buried in the archives of the Virginia Historical Society. But tonight, we're about to uncover the truth behind one of America's most methodical and terrifying killers. Before we continue with the story of Ruth Holloway and her deadly marriages, I want to hear from you. Hit that subscribe button if you're ready to dive deep into America's darkest historical mysteries, and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. I love connecting with fellow mystery lovers from across the country. The tale of Ruth Holloway begins not with murder, but with tragedy that would shape the course of 8 men's lives and deaths. The Virginia of 1780 was a land transformed by revolution and haunted by its aftermath. In the fertile tobacco region surrounding Richmond and Petersburg, grand plantations stretched along the James River, their white columned mansions standing as monuments to newfound American prosperity. The Revolutionary War had ended just 3 years prior, but its scars ran deep through Virginia society. Loyalist properties had been seized and redistributed, creating a new class of wealthy patriots while leaving others destitute. It was into this world of shifting fortunes and buried secrets that Ruth Holloway would emerge. Ruth arrived in Richmond in the autumn of 1782, a striking woman of 28, with auburn hair and eyes the color of winter fog. She claimed to be the widow of Captain Jonathan Holloway, a Continental Army officer who had allegedly died at the Battle of Yorktown. Her story was simple, yet heartbreaking. She had lost everything in the war and sought to start anew in Virginia, drawn by reports of the state's prosperity and the kindness of its people. What made Ruth remarkable was not just her beauty, but her intelligence and refinement. She spoke with the cultured accent of educated New England, could read Latin, and possessed an extensive knowledge of medicinal herbs and treatments. In an era when medical care was primitive and doctors scarce, Ruth's healing abilities quickly made her invaluable to Richmond's elite society. She carried with her a leather-bound journal filled with remedies passed down. She claimed through generations of her family. The Virginia gentry welcomed Ruth with open arms. The war had created a shortage of eligible women, as many had died from disease or fled with loyalist families. Here was a refined widow of impeccable manners who could discuss politics with the men and healing arts with the women. Within months of her arrival, Ruth had established herself in a modest but respectable house on Clay Street, supporting herself by treating ailments that range from consumption to nervous disorders. But beneath Richmond's polished surface, darker currents flowed. The war had created not just heroes, but profiteers and traitors. Whispered conversations in drawing rooms spoke of men who had switched sides for gold, of supply convoys mysteriously attacked by those who knew their routes, of patriot leaders betrayed to British forces. Some suspected the existence of a secret organization that had collaborated with the enemy, but proof remained elusive. These men had not only survived the war, but thrived in its aftermath. Their treason rewarded with seized loyalist properties and lucrative government contracts. It was in this atmosphere of prosperity built on betrayal that Ruth Holloway would begin her deadly courtship with Virginia's most prominent citizens. She seemed to possess an uncanny ability to attract the attention of the colony's most successful men: tobacco merchants, shipping, magnates, land speculators, and political figures. Each would fall under her spell. Each would marry her with great ceremony, and each would die under circumstances that, while suspicious to modern eyes, seemed perfectly natural to their contemporaries. The first sign that something was amiss came from an unexpected source: the slaves who worked in the great houses where Ruth's husbands lived. They whispered among themselves about the strange illnesses that befell their masters after marriage, always beginning with complaints of stomach pain, followed by weakness, and ending in death. But in a society where slave testimony carried no legal weight, their observations were dismissed as superstition and jealousy. The first death occurred on a humid August night in 1783, less than 6 months after Ruth had married Colonel Edmund Fairfax, one of Richmond's most successful tobacco merchants. Fairfax, a robust man of 45 who had never shown signs of illness, was found dead in his study by his house servant Jupiter at dawn on August 15th. Jupiter would later tell other slaves what he had witnessed that night, though his account would never reach white ears. He had been awakened around midnight by sounds from his master's study. Not the usual shuffling of papers or clink of brandy glasses, but something else. A low moaning followed by the scrape of a chair being pushed back. When Jupiter crept to the window to investigate, he saw his master doubled over his desk, clutching his stomach, while Mrs. Ruth stood beside him with a concerned expression, offering him a steaming cup of what appeared to be medicinal tea. "Drink this, my dear Edmund," Jupiter heard her say in her soothing voice. "It will ease the pain. I prepared it with special care." Colonel Fairfax raised his head with obvious effort. His face, Jupiter noted with alarm, was ashen and covered in perspiration, despite the cool night air. "The pain. It's getting worse. Ruth, perhaps we should call for Dr. Harrison." Ruth's hand rested gently on her husband's shoulder. "Nonsense, darling. Dr. Harrison is miles away. And besides, this remedy has been used in my family for generations. Trust me." Her voice carried that same melodic quality that had charmed Richmond's society. But in the darkness, Jupiter detected something else beneath it, a note of insistence that balked no argument. The colonel drank from the cup, and within minutes his moaning intensified. Jupiter watched in horror as his master convulsed, once, twice, then collapsed forward onto his desk, sending papers and inkwells scattering to the floor. Ruth stood perfectly still for a long moment, watching. Then, with movements that seemed oddly calm for a woman who had just witnessed her husband's apparent death throes, she retrieved the cup, rinsed it thoroughly in a basin of water she had apparently prepared in advance, and only then began to scream for help. When Dr. Harrison arrived at dawn, he found Ruth in a state of convincing grief, clutching her husband's body and weeping inconsolably. The symptoms she described were consistent with acute gastric distress, possibly brought on by tainted food or nervous excitement. Colonel Fairfax had been involved in some contentious business dealings recently, she explained, and had complained of stomach problems for several days. Dr. Harrison's examination revealed nothing unusual. The colonel's body showed no signs of violence, and the gastric symptoms Ruth described were common enough in the Virginia climate, where spoiled food and impure water frequently caused similar ailments. He recorded the cause of death as acute gastric fever and offered his condolences to the grieving widow. What Dr. Harrison didn't know, and what Ruth had counted on, was that the medicinal knowledge she claimed as family tradition actually came from a far more sinister source. During her journey to Virginia, Ruth had spent several weeks in Philadelphia, where she had developed an intimate relationship with the disgraced physician named Dr. Marcus Wainwright. Wainwright had been expelled from practice after experimenting with various plant extracts as means of causing untraceable deaths. His research, conducted in secret and never published, had identified several native plants that could produce symptoms mimicking common illnesses while leaving no trace in the body after death. Ruth had not only learned Wainwright's methods, but had improved upon them. She discovered that by combining small amounts of certain plant alkaloids with common medicinal herbs, she could create preparations that would ease genuine ailments when used in small doses, but prove fatal when administered in larger quantities or specific combinations. Her leather journal contained not family remedies, but carefully recorded formulas for murder disguised as medicine. The funeral of Colonel Fairfax was attended by the cream of Richmond society. Ruth played the role of grieving widow to perfection, fainting at the graveside and being supported by sympathetic friends. The Colonel's will, drawn up shortly after their marriage, left Ruth a substantial inheritance, including the house on Clay Street and a considerable sum in gold and land holdings. But Ruth's grief proved remarkably short-lived. Within 3 months of the funeral, she was seen accepting the attentions of another prominent gentleman, Captain William Randolph, a shipping magnate who had made his fortune running supplies to the Continental Army during the war. Those who remarked on the speed of her recovery were gently reminded that a woman alone in the world needed protection, and Captain Randolph was known to be a man of honor and substance. What none of Ruth's admirers suspected was that she had not chosen them at random. Each man she targeted shared a common secret. They had all been members of a clandestine organization that had provided intelligence to British forces during the war. Colonel Fairfax had been the group's treasurer responsible for distributing British gold to American traders. Ruth's seemingly chance arrival in Richmond and her subsequent romantic conquests were anything but coincidental. They were the opening moves in a game of revenge that would claim 8 lives before it was finished. Captain William Randolph's death, barely 8 months after his marriage to Ruth, in January 1784, followed an eerily similar pattern. The robust sea captain, known for his iron constitution and ability to weather the worst storms along the Atlantic coast, succumbed to what Dr. Harrison diagnosed as bilious fever after 3 days of intense stomach pain and weakness. By now, Jupiter had been sold to another household, but the slave community maintained its own network of information. Word spread quickly about the strange coincidence of another of Mrs. Ruth's husbands dying of stomach ailments. Old Caesar, who worked in the Randolph household, reported similar observations to those Jupiter had made, his master falling ill after accepting medicinal tea from his wife, Ruth's unnaturally calm demeanor during the crisis, and her insistence that no other physician be called. But it was Caesar who made a discovery that would prove crucial to understanding Ruth's methods. While cleaning the captain's study after his death, Caesar found a small vial hidden behind a loose board in the wall. The vial contained a fine white powder that smelled faintly of almonds and bitter herbs. When he showed it to Jupiter during a chance meeting at the Richmond market, the older slave's face went pale. "Same thing I seen at Colonel Fairfax's house," Jupiter whispered, glancing around nervously. "Found one just like it in the kitchen after the master died. When I showed it to the cook, she made me throw it in the river and told me never to speak of it." The slaves began to keep their own careful records, passing information through their community network. They noted that Ruth always insisted on personally preparing her husband's medicines, that she kept her supplies locked in a special chest, that she never allowed servants to handle, and that she had an unusual knowledge of plants that grew wild in the Virginia countryside. Most disturbing of all, they observed that Ruth would often take long walks alone in the forests surrounding Richmond, returning with baskets of what appeared to be common herbs, but which he guarded jealously. Meanwhile, Ruth's position in Richmond society grew stronger with each tragedy. Captain Randolph's will had left her even wealthier than before, and her reputation as a devoted wife who had suffered terrible losses earned her widespread sympathy. The leading families of Virginia competed to include her in their social circles, viewing her as both an object of pity and a desirable addition to their gatherings. Ruth's third husband was Judge Thomas Henley, a prominent member of the Virginia House of Delegates and one of the architects of the state's new legal system. Their courtship was brief but passionate, with the judge declaring that Ruth had restored his faith and love after the death of his first wife during the war. They married in June 1785, in a ceremony that was considered one of the social events of the season. Judge Henley survived exactly 7 months. His death in January 1786 was particularly shocking because it occurred during a dinner party at their home with a dozen of Richmond's most prominent citizens as witnesses. Henley had been in excellent health and high spirits throughout the evening, regaling his guests with stories of the constitutional conventions and his hopes for Virginia's future. It was only after Ruth served him a special digestive tonic, prepared, she explained, according to a recipe her late mother had used for her father, that the judge began to show signs of distress. Dr. Harrison, now the third time called to treat one of Ruth's husband's fatal illnesses, began to harbor private suspicions, but suspicion was not evidence, and Ruth's behavior remained beyond reproach. She had witnesses to her husband's illness. She had never been alone with him during his final hours, and the symptoms were consistent with any number of natural ailments. Moreover, she was a woman of impeccable reputation, wealth, and social standing. To accuse her of murder would require proof that simply didn't exist, at least not in any form that the legal system would recognize. The pattern continued with ruthless precision. Husband number 4 was plantation owner George Carrington, who died of acute dyspepsia in 1787. Number 5 was merchant Samuel Bradford, who succumbed to nervous fever in 1788. Number 6 was banker Edward Custis, dead of gastric apoplexy in 1789. Each death made Ruth wealthier and more powerful. Each funeral saw her grief grow more theatrical, and each new marriage brought fresh whispers of coincidence that seemed too remarkable to be natural. It was after the death of Edward Custis that a pattern began to emerge among those who paid careful attention. Dr. Marcus Wainwright, the disgraced physician Ruth had known in Philadelphia, had arrived in Richmond in late 1789, claiming to seek a fresh start in Virginia. He rented a small house on the outskirts of town and lived quietly, seeing few patients and keeping largely to himself. But Caesar, now working for a family near Wainwright's residence, noticed that Ruth made regular visits to the doctor's house, always arriving at dusk and leaving after dark. What Caesar couldn't know was that these visits were not social calls, but business meetings. Wainwright had discovered Ruth's true identity through his own sources and had come to Richmond not seeking redemption, but seeking profit. He knew what Ruth was doing and why, and he wanted his share of the wealth she was accumulating. Their arrangement was simple. He would continue to provide her with new and improved methods of poisoning, and she would pay him a percentage of each inheritance. But Wainwright had made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed that because Ruth needed his expertise, she would continue to tolerate his demands for money and his increasingly bold suggestions that they expand their operations to other cities. He failed to understand that Ruth's murders were not motivated by simple greed, but by a desire for justice that burned with an intensity that would not be compromised by a partner's avarice. The mysterious deaths that had begun with Colonel Fairfax were building toward a climax that would shake the foundations of Virginia society. Ruth had identified the remaining members of the secret organization that had betrayed her first husband, and her list was nearly complete. Only 2 names remained. Dr. Harrison himself, who had been the group's contact within the medical community and the most prominent target of all, Governor Edmund Randolph, the powerful politician who had coordinated the entire treasonous operation from his position in the colonial government. The autumn of 1790 brought an unexpected complication to Ruth's methodical campaign of revenge. A new arrival in Richmond society would prove to be both her greatest challenge and the key to understanding the full scope of her deadly plan. Captain Jonathan Hale was a former Continental Army intelligence officer who had been investigating wartime treason cases for the federal government. Officially, he was in Richmond to settle property disputes arising from Loyalist confiscations. Unofficially, he had been tracking rumors of a secret organization that had provided British forces with American military intelligence during the war. His investigation had led him to identify several members of this treasonous network, and he had noted with interest that many of them had died under mysterious circumstances in recent years. What made Captain Hale particularly dangerous to Ruth was his military training in recognizing patterns, and his access to intelligence files that contained information about suspected traitors. Unlike the local authorities, who saw only a series of unfortunate coincidences, Hale began to see connections that pointed toward a deliberate campaign of elimination. Hale's first significant discovery came through his friendship with Dr. Harrison. During a casual conversation about the unusual number of prominent men who had died of stomach ailments in recent years, the doctor mentioned his growing unease about the pattern of deaths among Ruth's husbands. What particularly troubled Harrison was that each victim had died despite receiving what appeared to be appropriate medical care from their devoted wife. It's most peculiar, Jonathan Dr. Harrison confided during a private dinner at his home. Mrs. Holloway seems to have the most dreadful luck with husbands. Yet, she's one of the most attentive wives I've ever encountered. She knows more about medicinal treatments than many physicians, and she's always eager to help with the care of her ailing spouses. If I didn't know better, I'd swear she was trying to save them, rather than. He paused, unwilling to voice his suspicions aloud. Captain Hale leaned forward with interest. Rather than what, Doctor? Harrison shook his head. Forgive me. I shouldn't speak ill of a woman who has suffered such terrible losses. It's just that in 30 years of practice, I've never seen such a concentrated series of similar deaths in one family. That night, Hale began his own investigation into Ruth Holloway's background. What he discovered sent chills down his spine. There was no record of Captain Jonathan Holloway in Continental Army files. No officer by that name had died at Yorktown or any other battle. The woman calling herself Ruth Holloway had appeared in Richmond with a completely fabricated identity, and her true origins remained a mystery. Meanwhile, Ruth had identified her seventh target, merchant Prince Alexander Fitzhugh, one of the wealthiest men in Virginia and a secret member of the treasonous organization she was systematically destroying. Fitzhugh had made his fortune by providing British forces with information about American supply convoys, enabling enemy raids that had cost hundreds of Patriot lives. His betrayal had been particularly heinous because he had used his position as a supplier to the Continental Army to gather intelligence on American movements and weaknesses. Ruth's courtship of Fitzhugh began in the winter of 1790 and followed her established pattern. She presented herself as a lonely widow in need of companionship and protection, while gradually revealing her extensive knowledge of business and finance. Fitzhugh, a widower himself, was charmed by her combination of vulnerability and intelligence. Within 3 months, he had proposed marriage, but this time, Ruth faced unexpected scrutiny. Captain Hale had quietly alerted several prominent citizens to his suspicions about the mysterious widow, and word had begun to spread through Richmond's tight-knit elite society. When Fitzhugh announced his engagement to Ruth, several of his friends urged, "Caution, Alexander. Surely you've noticed the peculiar pattern," warned tobacco magnate Robert Carter during a private meeting at the Richmond Club. 7 husbands, 7 mysterious deaths. Even if one accepts that Mrs. Holloway is simply unlucky in marriage, surely such a concentration of tragedy warrants some investigation. Fitzhugh's response revealed the power of Ruth's psychological manipulation. "Gentlemen, I understand your concern, but I must point out that your suspicions are based on nothing more than coincidence and gossip. Mrs. Holloway has been examined by the finest physicians and questioned by the most respected magistrates. She has been cleared of any wrongdoing repeatedly. Are we to condemn a woman simply because fate has dealt her a cruel hand?" What Fitzhugh didn't know was that Ruth had been carefully studying his own role in wartime treason through documents stolen from Dr. Zam, Marcus Waywright's files. Waywright, in his continuing attempts to blackmail Ruth into sharing more of her profits, had been conducting his own investigation into her targets. He had discovered that Ruth's victims were all connected by their membership in a secret society called the Covenant of Prosperity, which had coordinated intelligence sharing with British forces in exchange for post-war business advantages. The revelation that Waywright knew about the Covenant convinced Ruth that her partner had become too dangerous to allow to live. On a cold February night in 1791, Dr. Marcus Waywright was found dead in his home, apparently having consumed a fatal dose of his own experimental poisons. The magistrate's investigation concluded that the disgraced physician had taken his own life rather than face exposure of his illegal experiments. Ruth attended Waywright's funeral with appropriate solemnity, But privately she felt a sense of relief. The only person who could have connected her to a source of exotic poisons was now dead. And with his death, the last external threat to her mission had been eliminated. She was now free to complete her work without interference. Alexander Fitzhugh married Ruth Holloway on March 15, 1791, in a ceremony that was notably smaller and more subdued than her previous weddings. Captain Hale attended as a guest, watching Ruth carefully throughout the proceedings and noting her complete composure and apparent happiness. If she was indeed a serial killer, she was remarkably skilled at concealing her true nature. The marriage lasted 4 months. Alexander Fitzhugh died on July 20, 1791, after a brief illness that began with stomach pains and ended with complete systemic collapse. Dr. Harrison, now deeply suspicious but still lacking concrete evidence, performed the most thorough examination of his career. He found nothing that would legally constitute proof of poisoning, but privately he was convinced that Fitzhugh had been murdered. Ruth's performance as the grieving widow reached new heights of theatrical skill. She collapsed at the funeral, required smelling salts to revive her, and spent weeks in seclusion, apparently overcome by grief. But those who knew her well began to notice subtle changes in her behavior. She seemed more confident, more imperious, and less concerned with maintaining the facade of helpless femininity that had served her so well in the past. With Fitzhugh's death, Ruth had accumulated a fortune that made her one of the wealthiest women in Virginia. More importantly, she had eliminated 7 of the 8 members of the Covenant of Prosperity. Only one target remained, Dr. Harrison himself, the physician who had served as the organization's medical contact and who now posed the greatest threat to her continued freedom. But Ruth had not anticipated that Captain Hale's investigation would lead him to uncover her true identity and the real reason for her deadly campaign. In the files of a captured British intelligence officer, Hale had found references to an American spy network that included a woman identified only as the widow. This mysterious figure had reportedly lost her husband to Patriot forces and had sworn revenge against those responsible for his death. Cross-referencing this information with military records, Hale made a shocking discovery. Captain Jonathan Holloway had indeed existed, but he had been a British spy operating under deep cover within the Continental Army. He had been captured and executed by American forces in 1779 after being betrayed by members of his own spy network, the same network that would later become the Covenant of Prosperity. Ruth Holloway was not seeking justice for Patriot betrayal. She was seeking revenge for the death of a traitor. Her husband had been a British agent, and his execution had been both legal and justified. The members of the Covenant had betrayed him not to the British, but to the Americans, seeking to eliminate a competitor who knew too much about their own treasonous activities. This revelation changed everything about the case. But it also made Ruth infinitely more dangerous. She was not a grieving Patriot widow seeking to punish traitors. She was a British loyalist, executing American heroes who had helped win the war for independence. Her campaign of murder was not justice, but treason itself. Captain Hale's discovery of Ruth's true identity came at a critical moment, for he learned that she had already begun her final courtship. Her 8th and last target was not Dr. Harrison, as Hale had expected, but Governor Edmund Randolph himself, the most powerful man in Virginia and the secret leader of the Covenant of Prosperity. The governor's interest in Ruth had been carefully cultivated over several months. She had positioned herself at social events where she knew he would be present, had arranged to be introduced by mutual friends, and had gradually revealed herself to be a woman of extraordinary intelligence and refinement. Unlike her previous targets, Governor Randolph was already married, but Ruth had observed that his wife was frequently ill and confined to bed rest. Ruth's approach to Randolph was different from her previous campaigns. Rather than presenting herself as a vulnerable widow in need of protection, she portrayed herself as a woman of independent means who could be a valuable political ally. She demonstrated an impressive knowledge of Virginia politics and showed herself to be a shrewd judge of character and opportunity. In short, she made herself indispensable to a man whose ambitions extended far beyond the governor's mansion. What made this courtship particularly dangerous was that Governor Randolph was himself a man of considerable intelligence and experience. He had survived the treacherous currents of revolutionary politics, had helped draft the Constitution and had built a network of allies and informants throughout Virginia and beyond. If anyone could recognize Ruth's true nature, it would be him. But Ruth had one crucial advantage. She knew exactly what kind of man Randolph was beneath his public persona, while he saw her only as she chose to present herself. Through her research into the Covenant of Prosperity, Ruth had learned that Randolph's treason during the war had been motivated not by ideology, but by pure ambition. He had provided British forces with intelligence because he believed the revolution would fail and wanted to position himself advantageously in the post-war world. When it became clear that the Americans would win, he had betrayed his British contacts to save his own reputation. In the spring of 1792, Governor Randolph's wife died of consumption after a long illness. Ruth attended the funeral and offered her condolences with perfect propriety. She then withdrew from social activities for several weeks, ostensibly to avoid any appearance of impropriety during the governor's period of mourning. During this interlude, Captain Hale made a desperate attempt to warn Governor Randolph about Ruth's deadly history. He requested a private meeting and laid out his evidence: the suspicious pattern of deaths, Ruth's fabricated identity, and the connection between her victims and wartime treason. But Hale's revelations had an unexpected effect on the governor. Rather than being alarmed by Ruth's murderous past, Randolph was impressed by her skill and determination. Here was a woman who had successfully eliminated 7 men without ever being caught or even seriously suspected by the legal authorities. Her methods were subtle, her planning meticulous, and her execution flawless. Instead of seeing her as a threat, he began to view her as a potential asset. Captain Hale, the governor said after listening to the intelligence officer's warnings, "I appreciate your concern for my safety, but I believe you may have misunderstood Mrs. Holloway's situation. If she has indeed been eliminating enemies of the state, men who betrayed their country during the war, then she has been performing a valuable service. Perhaps it is time someone recognized her patriotic contributions rather than viewing them with suspicion." Hale left the meeting with a growing sense of dread. Governor Randolph had not only dismissed his warnings, but seemed actively interested in allying himself with a known killer. The implications were terrifying. If Ruth and the governor joined forces, they could eliminate anyone they chose to target, using the full resources of the state government to cover their tracks. What Captain Hale didn't know was that Governor Randolph had already begun his own investigation into Ruth's background, and his findings had led him to a very different conclusion about her motives. Through his network of informants, he had learned about her true identity and her connection to the executed British spy, Jonathan Holloway. He knew that Ruth was seeking revenge against the members of the Covenant, and he knew that he was likely her final target. But instead of fleeing or seeking protection, Governor Randolph decided to confront Ruth directly. He believed that her desire for revenge could be redirected toward more useful targets, and that her skills as an assassin could serve his political ambitions. In his mind, Ruth Holloway was not a threat to be eliminated, but a weapon to be controlled. The confrontation came during a private dinner at the governor's mansion in June 1792. Ruth had accepted his invitation, believing it was a romantic overture. But she found herself facing a man who knew exactly who she was and what she had done. "Mrs. Holloway," the governor said as they sat in his private study after dinner. "Or, should I say, Mrs. Jonathan Holloway, widow of the British agent, executed for treason in 1779. I think it's time we dispensed with pretenses and spoke honestly about your situation." Ruth's reaction was swift, but controlled. Her hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the small vial of poison she always carried in her reticule. But she stopped when she saw that the governor was watching her with amused interest rather than fear. "I see you understand each other," Randolph continued. "Good. That will make our negotiation much simpler. You see, my dear, I know all about your campaign of revenge against the members of the Covenant of Prosperity. I know that you've successfully eliminated 7 of the 8 members, and I know that you believe me to be the 8th and final target on your list. Ruth's gray eyes never left his face as she spoke for the first time since his revelation. "And are you not afraid, Governor? You betrayed my husband to save yourself. And you've watched me kill 7 men without lifting a finger to warn them or stop me. What makes you think I won't complete my work tonight?" Randolph smiled coldly. "Because, my dear Mrs. Holloway, you need me alive more than you need me dead. You see, there were not 8 members of the Covenant of Prosperity, there were 9. The revelation hit Ruth like a physical blow. For over a decade, she had believed that her list was complete, that eliminating the 8 members of the Covenant would satisfy her need for vengeance. Now she learned that there was one more traitor, one more target, one more death required to complete her mission. "Who?" she whispered, her composure finally beginning to crack. "Captain Jonathan Hale," the governor replied. "The man who has been investigating your activities with such dedication. He was the Covenant's intelligence analyst, the one who identified your husband as a security risk and recommended his elimination. He's been hunting you not out of duty to justice, but out of fear that you would eventually discover his role in your husband's death." And just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Richmond intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this deadly game of revenge and betrayal. The game between Ruth Holloway and Governor Randolph was about to enter its final and most dangerous phase, with Captain Hale as the unwitting prize in a contest between 2 of the most ruthless killers in American history. Governor Randolph's revelation about Captain Hale transformed Ruth's mission from a simple quest for revenge into a complex web of betrayal and counter-betrayal that would test her skills against the most dangerous opponent she had ever faced. But the governor had miscalculated Ruth's psychology. He assumed that her desire for complete vengeance would make her willing to accept him as a partner. Instead, it only intensified her determination to eliminate every member of the conspiracy that had destroyed her life. "You propose an alliance, Governor," Ruth said, her voice steady despite the shock of learning about Hale's true identity. "But what assurance do I have that you won't betray me as you betrayed my husband, as you betrayed the British, as you betrayed your fellow conspirators?" Randolph leaned back in his chair, studying Ruth with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to measuring the worth and danger of potential allies and enemies. "Because, my dear, we each possess information that could destroy the other. You know about my wartime activities, and I know about your campaign of murder. We are bound together by mutual assured destruction." But Ruth had already made her decision. The conversation with Randolph had served its purpose. She now knew the identity of her 9th and final target, and she had confirmed that the governor was indeed as ruthless and immoral as she had suspected. There would be no alliance, no partnership, no shared future. There would only be death. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse that played out over several weeks in the summer of 1792. Ruth appeared to accept Randolph's proposal while secretly preparing to eliminate both him and Captain Hale. The governor, meanwhile, believed he had successfully recruited a valuable assassin while planning to eliminate her once she had served his purposes. Captain Hale, unaware that his true identity had been discovered, continued his investigation into Ruth's activities. He had begun to compile evidence that he hoped would be sufficient to bring charges against her, including testimony from several slaves who had witnessed suspicious activities in the households where Ruth's husbands had died. What he didn't know was that both Ruth and Governor Randolph were watching his every move, each planning to use his investigation for their own ends. The climax began on the evening of August 15, 1792, exactly 9 years after Colonel Fairfax's death. Ruth had invited both Governor Randolph and Captain Hale to a private dinner at her mansion, ostensibly to discuss a business proposition that would benefit all 3 of them. Each man accepted the invitation, believing that he held the upper hand in whatever game was being played. The dinner proceeded with perfect civility, with Ruth playing the gracious hostess and her two guests engaging in polite conversation about politics and business. But beneath the surface pleasantries, a deadly tension was building. Each person at the table knew more about the others than they were revealing, and each was waiting for the right moment to strike. Ruth had prepared her most sophisticated poisoning scheme yet, using a combination of techniques she had developed over her years of experience. Rather than relying on a single toxin, she had prepared multiple poisons that would work in combination to create untraceable deaths. The beauty of her plan was that each man would receive a different poison, making it appear that their deaths were unrelated coincidences rather than coordinated murders. For Governor Randolph, she had prepared a slow-acting compound derived from foxglove and hemlock that would simulate a heart attack, fitting for a man of his age and stressful position. The poison had been carefully measured and mixed into a special brandy she had imported from France, specifically for the occasion. She would present it as a rare vintage worthy of celebrating their new partnership. Captain Hale would receive a different fate entirely. Ruth had developed a particularly clever method for his elimination, a contact poison applied to the rim of his wine glass that would absorb through his skin and cause symptoms resembling apoplexy. The beauty of this approach was that death would not occur for several hours, allowing Hale to leave her home apparently healthy and die in his own quarters, removing any direct connection to the dinner party. But Ruth had not anticipated that Governor Randolph would arrive at the dinner already knowing about her plans. Through his network of servants and informants, he had learned about her recent activities, the purchasing of unusual herbs, the late-night visits to abandoned buildings where she prepared her compounds, and most damning of all, the discovery of her journal containing detailed records of all her previous murders. As the three sat down to dinner, Ruth noticed that Governor Randolph seemed unusually relaxed and confident, while Captain Hale appeared tense and distracted. She interpreted this as evidence that her deception was working. Randolph believed himself safe as her ally. While Hale was growing suspicious, but didn't yet understand the full scope of his danger, the conversation during dinner revealed the complex psychological dynamics at play. Ruth spoke eloquently about the nature of justice and revenge, weaving philosophical observations into seemingly casual remarks. "I've always believed," she said while serving the main course, "that those who betray trust deserve to face the consequences of their actions, no matter how much time has passed." Governor Randolph nodded approvingly. "Indeed, Mrs. Holloway. Justice delayed is not justice denied, particularly when the delay serves to make the eventual reckoning more complete." Captain Hale, increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, attempted to steer the discussion towards safer topics. "Surely we can agree that revenge, however justified it might seem, is ultimately destructive to both the avenger and society as a whole. The rule of law exists precisely to prevent individuals from taking justice into their own hands." Ruth's smile was cold as she responded, "But Captain, what happens when the law itself has been corrupted by those who deserve punishment? What recourse remains for those who have been wronged, when the very institutions meant to provide justice are controlled by the guilty?" It was at this moment that Captain Hale realized he was not merely a guest at this dinner, but a target. The philosophical discussion was not abstract. It was Ruth's way of explaining why she intended to kill him. His hand moved instinctively toward his coat, where he carried a pistol, but Governor Randolph's sharp glance warned him against any sudden movements. "Gentlemen," Ruth said, rising from her seat with graceful composure, "I believe it's time we move to the library for brandy and honest conversation. I have something special I'd like to share with you both." As they moved to the library, each person was acutely aware that they were walking into the final confrontation of a deadly game that had been building for over a decade. Ruth had positioned herself between her two targets and the door, cutting off their most obvious escape route. Governor Randolph noted the strategic positioning but remained confident in his ability to outmaneuver a woman he still viewed as a useful but ultimately expendable tool. Captain Hale, now certain of his danger, was calculating the odds of survival if he made a desperate attempt to fight his way out. The library, where Ruth had chosen to stage her final scene, was perfectly appointed for her purposes. Heavy curtains blocked the windows, muffling sound from the street. The servants had been dismissed for the evening, ensuring no witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. Most importantly, Ruth had prepared the room with everything she would need to dispose of 2 bodies and create convincing explanations for their deaths. "Now then," Ruth said as she moved to a sideboard laden with crystal decanters. "I promised you both honest conversation, and I intend to deliver. Governor Randolph, you believe you have successfully manipulated me into becoming your personal assassin, Captain Hale. You believe you have gathered enough evidence to bring charges against me for the murder of my 8 husbands. You are both correct in your assessments, and you are both fatally wrong in your assumptions about what I intend to do with this knowledge." She turned to face them, holding 2 glasses of what appeared to be expensive French brandy. "The truth is that neither of you will leave this room alive tonight. Governor Randolph, you will die, because you were the leader of the conspiracy that murdered my husband. Captain Hale, you will die, because you were the intelligence analyst who identified him as a security risk. Your deaths will complete my mission and provide me with the justice I have sought for 13 long years." Governor Randolph's composure finally cracked as he realized that his manipulation had failed completely. "Mrs. Holloway, I think you underestimate the consequences of murdering a sitting governor. My death will not go unnoticed or uninvestigated. You cannot simply add me to your list of victims and expect to escape scrutiny." Ruth's laugh was genuinely amused. "Governor, I have killed 8 prominent men without ever being seriously suspected of a crime. I have accumulated a fortune, established myself in the highest levels of society, and eliminated nearly all of my enemies while maintaining a reputation as a grieving widow deserving of sympathy and protection. What makes you think that killing you and Captain Hale will present any greater challenge?" Captain Hale, his military training finally overcoming his shock, made his move. Rather than attempting to flee or negotiate, he lunged toward Ruth, hoping to disarm her before she could administer whatever poison she had prepared. But Ruth had anticipated this possibility and was ready for him. As Hale charged toward her, Ruth threw the contents of 1 brandy glass directly into his face. The liquid contained not poison, but a powerful irritant derived from native Virginia plants that would cause temporary blindness and severe pain. As Hale stumbled backward, clawing at his burning eyes, Ruth drew a small pistol from beneath her shawl, a weapon she had taken from one of her previous victims and kept for emergencies. Governor Randolph, seeing his opportunity, attempted to tackle Ruth while she was focused on Hale, but he had severely underestimated both her physical capabilities and her preparation for this moment. Ruth spun toward him with fluid grace, bringing the pistol to bear on his chest. "I don't think so, Governor," she said calmly. "After all these years of planning, I'm not about to let either of you spoil my moment of triumph." The confrontation that followed revealed the full extent of Ruth's transformation from grieving widow to calculating killer. She had become something far more dangerous than a simple poisoner. She was a strategist who had spent over a decade perfecting not just her methods of murder, but her understanding of human psychology and the weaknesses that could be exploited in even the most powerful men. "You want to know the truth about your precious covenant of prosperity?" Ruth asked, keeping the pistol trained on Randolph while ensuring she could see Hale, who was slowly recovering from the attack on his eyes. It wasn't a patriotic organization working to eliminate British spies. It was a group of ambitious men who sold information to whoever paid the most, switching sides whenever it served your interests. You betrayed my husband, not because he was a threat to American independence, but because he had discovered evidence of your own treason and was preparing to expose you to both sides. Governor Randolph's face went pale as Ruth revealed her knowledge of the Covenant's true activities. "How could you possibly know that? Those records were destroyed years ago." Ruth smiled coldly. Governor, you made the mistake of assuming that a woman motivated by love and grief would be less thorough in her research than a man motivated by political ambition. I have spent 13 years tracking down every document, every witness, every scrap of evidence related to my husband's death and your organization's activities. I know more about the Covenant of Prosperity than any of its surviving members ever did. What Ruth revealed next would shake the foundations of Virginia's post-revolutionary society. The Covenant had not simply sold intelligence to the British during the war. They had orchestrated a complex scheme to profit from both sides of the conflict while positioning themselves advantageously, regardless of the outcome. They had stolen supplies meant for Continental Army, sold strategic information that led to American defeats, and eliminated competitors who threatened their monopoly on corruption. My husband discovered your scheme in 1779, Ruth continued, but instead of reporting it to British authorities, he attempted to blackmail you. That was his fatal mistake. You couldn't afford to let him expose your activities, but you also couldn't simply kill him yourselves without risking exposure. So you betrayed him to the Continental Army as a British spy, knowing that Patriot justice would eliminate your problem while making you appear loyal to the American cause. Captain Hale, his vision gradually clearing, finally understood the full scope of what had been happening around him for the past decade. Dear God, he whispered. You're not seeking justice for British loyalists. You're seeking revenge for the corruption that killed your husband. Ruth nodded approvingly. Finally, Captain, you understand. Jonathan was indeed a British agent, but he was also my husband and the father of the child I lost when I fled after his execution. Your conspiracy didn't just kill him, it destroyed everything I had built, everything I loved, everything that gave meaning to my life. You turned me into the weapon I have become. The psychological portrait that emerged during this confrontation revealed Ruth Holloway as something unprecedented in American criminal history. A woman who had systematically dismantled an entire conspiracy network through patience, intelligence, and an understanding of human nature that bordered on the supernatural. She had not simply killed her targets, she had studied them, understood their weaknesses, and used their own character flaws to orchestrate their destruction. Governor Randolph, in a desperate attempt to save his life, made one final offer. Mrs. Holloway, if you spare me, I can give you something more valuable than revenge. I can give you power. With my political connections and your unique skills, we could control not just Virginia, but influence the entire federal government. Think of what we could accomplish together. Ruth's response revealed the depth of her commitment to her mission and her complete transformation from the vulnerable widow she had once appeared to be. Governor, you still don't understand what drives me. This was never about power or wealth or position in society. This was about love. Love for a man you murdered. Love for a life you destroyed. Love for justice that your corrupt system could never provide. Power corrupts as you have so thoroughly demonstrated. But love endures, and love demands satisfaction. Okay. The final moments of the confrontation unfolded with the precision and inevitability of a perfectly planned execution. Ruth had orchestrated every detail of this evening, not just to kill her final targets, but to ensure that their deaths would appear to be the result of their own actions rather than her intervention. The bodies of Governor Edmund Randolph and Captain Jonathan Hale were discovered the following morning by servants arriving to prepare the mansion for the day. The scene that greeted them appeared to tell a clear and tragic story. The two men had apparently engaged in a violent confrontation that had ended with both their deaths. Governor Randolph was found in the library with a bullet wound to the chest. Captain Hale's pistol clutched in his hand. Captain Hale lay nearby, apparently having succumbed to a combination of chemical burns to his face and a severe blow to the head from a heavy crystal decanter that lay shattered beside his body. The room showed signs of a desperate struggle, with furniture overturned and papers scattered across the floor. Ruth Holloway was discovered bound and gagged in a closet off the library, apparently having been imprisoned there during the confrontation between the two men. When released by the horrified servants, she collapsed in apparent shock and grief, unable for several minutes to coherently explain what had happened. When Dr. Harrison arrived to examine the bodies and interview Ruth, her account of the evening's events was both heartbreaking and convincing. She explained that Captain Hale had arrived at the dinner in an agitated state, making wild accusations about Governor Randolph's wartime activities and demanding that she provide testimony to support charges of treason. The governor had initially attempted to calm the situation, but when Hale produced documents that seemed to implicate Randolph in wartime corruption, the confrontation had escalated beyond control. They began shouting at each other. Ruth sobbed to Dr. Harrison, and then Captain Hale drew his pistol. The governor tried to take it away from him, and in the struggle it discharged. Captain Hale was wounded by the broken glass, and then I don't remember clearly. Someone grabbed me and shoved me into the closet. I heard more fighting and then silence. Dr. Harrison's examination of the scene supported Ruth's account. The physical evidence was consistent with a violent struggle between two men, and Ruth's injuries, rope burns on her wrists and ankles, bruises consistent with being roughly handled, appeared genuine. Moreover, her reputation as a respected widow who had suffered terrible losses made it inconceivable that she could have orchestrated such violence herself. The investigation that followed was cursory at best, with both principal witnesses dead and Ruth's testimony providing a plausible explanation for their deaths. The authorities concluded that Captain Hale and Governor Randolph had killed each other in a dispute over wartime treason allegations. The documents that Hale had apparently brought to support his accusations were found burned in the library fireplace, their contents lost forever. What the investigators didn't know was that Ruth had spent months preparing for this exact scenario. The documents Hale had supposedly brought were forgeries she had created to provide a motive for the confrontation. The chemical that had blinded Hale was a compound she had developed specifically to leave evidence consistent with an accidental injury during a fight. Even her own injuries were self-inflicted using techniques she had learned from her years of studying how to cause pain and damage without permanent harm. The deaths of Governor Randolph and Captain Hale marked the end of Ruth Holloway's campaign of revenge, but not the end of her story. With the elimination of all 9 members of the Covenant of Prosperity, she had achieved the justice she had sought for over a decade. More importantly, she had accumulated sufficient wealth and social standing to ensure her security for the rest of her life. In the months following the deaths, Ruth gradually withdrew from Richmond society. She claimed that the traumatic events in her library had damaged her health and her ability to function in social situations. She sold her mansion and moved to a smaller but elegant house on the outskirts of the city, where she lived quietly with only a few trusted servants. But Ruth's retirement from active murder did not mean she had lost her taste for control and manipulation. Over the years that followed, she became a behind-the-scenes power broker in Virginia politics, using her wealth and her knowledge of prominent citizens' secrets to influence elections, business deals, and social movements. She never remarried, claiming that she had suffered too much loss to risk her heart again. But she maintained friendships and correspondences with powerful men throughout the state and beyond. The true extent of Ruth's influence became apparent only after her death in 1834 at the age of 80. Among her papers, investigators found detailed records not only of her 9 murders, but of dozens of other schemes she had orchestrated over the years. She had blackmailed corrupt officials, manipulated business competitors into ruin, and engineered the social destruction of anyone who had crossed her or threatened her interests. Perhaps most shocking of all was the discovery of Ruth's complete journal, written in a code that took cryptographers months to decipher. The journal revealed that her campaign against the Covenant of Prosperity had been only the beginning of her career as what she called an agent of necessary justice. She had continued to eliminate people she deemed deserving of death, but had refined her methods to the point where her involvement was never even suspected. The journal entries from her later years revealed a woman who had been completely transformed by her experiences. The grieving widow who had arrived in Richmond in 1782 had evolved into something unprecedented in American history. A female crime lord who operated not for profit or power but for her own twisted sense of moral order. "I have become something that perhaps God never intended to exist," she wrote in one of her final entries, "but which the corruption of this world has made necessary. I am justice without law, retribution without mercy, and order without government. I have taken upon myself the responsibility of eliminating those whom society refuses to punish, and I have done so without regret or hesitation." The discovery of Ruth's journal created a sensation in Virginia society, but it also presented authorities with an impossible problem. Many of the people she claimed to have killed had died so long ago that no investigation was possible. Others had been prominent citizens whose reputations could not be tarnished without causing serious political and social upheaval. In the end, the decision was made to seal the journal and classify the entire case as a matter of state security. The story of Ruth Holloway remained buried in the archives of the Virginia Historical Society for nearly 2 centuries, surfacing only occasionally in the research of historians studying the post-revolutionary period. But those few scholars who encountered her case were invariably struck by the methodical nature of her crimes and the psychological sophistication of her methods. Modern forensic experts who have studied Ruth's techniques have concluded that she was far ahead of her time in understanding how to commit undetectable murders. Her use of plant-based toxins, her manipulation of crime scenes, and her ability to create false identities and motives would not be equaled by criminal investigators until the late 20th century. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Ruth Holloway's story is not her skill as a killer, but her success as a manipulator of public perception. For over 50 years, she maintained her reputation as a tragic figure deserving of sympathy and protection, while secretly operating as one of the most prolific murderers in American history. She proved that the most dangerous criminals are not those who operate outside society, but those who learn to control society from within. The implications of her case continue to resonate with law enforcement professionals and psychologists today. Ruth Holloway demonstrated that the combination of intelligence, patience, and complete moral flexibility could allow a single individual to subvert an entire social system for personal ends. She created a template for psychological manipulation and systematic murder that has been studied and copied by criminals ever since. This mystery shows us how revenge, when pursued with methodical intelligence and unlimited patience, can corrupt even the most refined exterior into something monstrous. Ruth Holloway's transformation from grieving widow to calculating killer reveals the terrifying potential that lies dormant within seemingly civilized society. What do you think of this story? Do you believe someone could really carry out such an elaborate campaign of revenge without being detected? Could Ruth's methods work in today's world? Or would modern investigative techniques have caught her? Leave your comment below and share your theories. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark mysteries. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most civilized, and the greatest crimes are those that history chooses to forget. See you in the next video.